Species. Unite.
But it makes a lot of sense that, especially when you think about how traditional healers and shamans have worked, they haven't felt that separation from nature like Western medics do. And so to rely on the knowledge of other species actually makes a lot of sense. So it's probably a lot more than we know at the moment.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. This conversation is with Dr. Jaap de Roode. Jaap is a biology professor at Emory University, and he is the author of an astonishing new book. It's called Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. I say astonishing mostly because I had no idea about so much that he talks about in his book. He tells the stories of how animals across nature, from bumblebees to chimpanzees, how they use plants and natural substances to treat infections, to ward off parasites, to self-medicate. And there's so much that we have learned from them, and there's so much more that we still can. It's very nice to meet you. It's nice to have you here.
You too.
Let's talk about your book, Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. It's all things I never really thought about and never even occurred to me that how much animals use medicine and how many doctors there are like roaming around in nature. And so thank you for putting it out there.
No, and I'm happy you said that, because that was really the goal of the book, was really try to show people that, hey, animals do all these fascinating things. And in some ways, it's not that surprising when you think about the fact that we are animals too, right? And so I think humans like to be very special, especially, humans in the Western world. We like to be unique and special and different from nature. But at the end of the day, we are part of nature. And so, we have all sorts of ways of medicating ourselves. In that sense, it's not that surprising that animals can do it, but at the same time, it is a topic that has long been ignored. And I felt that it was time to put it all together and to show people, that chimpanzees can do it, and they're very much like us. But now we have evidence that ants and bees and butterflies, they can do it too. And so it's just a whole world out there of all sorts of pharmacists and doctors.
I think that's exactly what happened to me while I was reading it. I'd never thought about any of this stuff. No one's really talks about it very much. And I talk to a lot of people who talk about animals and, how brilliant they are. But this just hasn't come up.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was kind of like, well, of course, because they need to heal themselves and protect themselves and care for themselves in the same ways that we do.
That's right. And we notice, right, when we have our pets, we take our pets to the vet. And so we know that animals, they need food, they need shelter, but they need medicine as well. And also what is interesting, I think one of the most surprising things for me when writing this book was that I started off the same way as you, not really thinking about animals doing this until my own research kind of pushed me in that direction to figure out if monarch butterflies can use medicine. This was about 15 years ago now. But what really surprised me writing the book is that a lot of people knew about this. So when you look at traditional healers and shamans, they have looked at animals for thousands of years to copy their behaviors and learn from all the medicine that these animals use. And so people have known about it for a long time. It's just as we have kind of, pushed ourselves away from nature in Western society, in Western science, really trying to in some ways actually depersonified animals as well, to really try to make this idea that we're very different. And if we assign things that we associate with humans to animals, we're not doing good science. I think that has played a role. But yeah, it's kind of knowledge that was known to humans and in some parts of the world has been lost. And now we're rediscovering it doing our science.
At one point, when you're talking about chimps in the book, and I can't remember what decade it was, but I think the 80s, where you say
correct.
At that time, Science didn't think chimps actually got sick. We just thought they were always healthy.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? It's partly because animals are really good at hiding injuries and disease. And you see that sometimes you see these nature documentaries, right? And I remember actually seeing this beautiful documentary with a clouded leopard, and it had a broken leg, but you couldn't tell because animals are hiding their injuries and their pain and their weaknesses so they don't become prey themselves. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is that just we just didn't look, and we figured, what is out there is surviving, and therefore it cannot be diseased. And it's kind of that idea that because once you get a disease and you cannot run to the pharmacy like humans do, you're going to die, right? So the animals we do see are the ones that have survived. They're not sick. They don't get sick. But it's just not the case at all. And really, when you start looking, take monarch butterflies. That's the system I know most about myself. You look at monarch butterflies here in North America, the ones that migrate to Mexico every year, about 10% of them have this really bad protozoan parasite that reduces their life, and it reduces their flight, and it can kill them and stop them mating. It's really horrendous. And yet 10% of them have it, right? So it's actually pretty common.
Talk about that, because that's what you started with. And you did a TED Talk 10 years ago about monarch butterflies and how they heal. Why did you start there?
Yeah, I start with the disease, right? Because monarch butterflies, amazing creatures. Most people know them because they undertake this spectacular migration from Canada and the United States down to Mexico every fall. And tens to hundreds of millions of monarchs go, and they go to a small place in central Mexico that's the size of just a few football fields. And they overwinter there until the spring. Really, really amazing. I've been there, and it's absolutely wonderful. But it's not the reason I started studying monarch butterflies. I started studying them because they become sick. Like we just said, animals get all sorts of diseases. I actually did my PhD research on malaria parasites. This was back at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And we used parasites, and we studied them in laboratory mice. And I really wanted to look at a system that was more natural than that. And so when I discovered that monarch butterflies have a protozoan parasite, so actually very similar to malaria parasites in humans and mosquitoes, I was sold. I thought, wow, that is so cool, because that's a system I can really try to understand parasites in a host in their natural situation. I started studying them. And then quickly, as I was doing this, I started rearing the monarch butterflies on different milkweed species. Now, monarch butterflies are specialist feeders as caterpillars. They can only feed on milkweeds, so they couldn't eat lettuce or any other plants. It has to be milkweeds, but there's different species of milkweeds. And milkweeds are very well known for a particular class of chemicals called cardenolides. And these are toxic chemicals that are really bad for most animals, but monarchs are resistant to them. And milkweeds have different levels. So different species of milkweeds have different concentrations of these chemicals. And so then I started rearing the monarchs in different species. And from there, I found out that the caterpillars, when they eat more toxic milkweed, they become less sick with the parasite. And so that was really the first indication that milkweeds can be medicinal. And that was cool to me. And then I thought, wow, what if the monarchs can actually choose the more toxic milkweed, the more medicinal milkweed when they are sick? Caterpillars that were infected with a parasite or not gave them choices between medicinal and non-medicinal milkweed. They had absolutely no preference. But then we thought, well, it's really their mothers that decide what they're going to eat, right? Because it's the mothers that lay eggs on the right plants. The caterpillars come out of the eggs and they start eating the plant on which the egg was laid. So then we asked the question, maybe the mothers make choices. And what you need to know is that when the monarchs are infected with these parasites, they carry hundreds of thousands or millions of parasite spores on the abdomen. And these parasites just sit there waiting. And when the female lays an egg, some of these parasites get stuck to the egg, into the leaf on which the egg is laid. The caterpillar then eats up the parasites and becomes infected. And so the female cannot avoid that. But what she can do is, when she's laying eggs, prefer to lay the eggs on the more medicinal milkweed. So that when the caterpillars come out of the egg, they start eating medicinal milkweed, they become less infected, less sick, and therefore have a better life.
It's incredible. They're doctor moms.
Yeah, mommy knows best. That's how we have always thought of it.
Is that why you decided to write the book? Like you just wanted to learn like who else and where else this was happening in the animal kingdom?
That's right. When we first did the experiments that showed that some milkweeds are medicinal and others are not, I think that was really exciting. It wasn't the first time that people had found that plants can be medicinal for insects, because people knew from moth species, for example, that if they ingested more chemicals or particular plants, they became less infected with viruses. But, having this information, I thought, well, this is really cool, especially since, milkweeds have always been thought, the chemicals in milkweeds have always been thought to help against predators, so the monarchs put the chemicals in their own tissues. Then they advertise that they're toxic with their beautiful, vibrant orange and black and white coloration, and predators don't eat them, right? That's always been the story. Being as focused and in love with parasites as I am, I thought, well, parasitism is a really big problem for a lot of animals out in the wild. And so from there, the idea that, well, maybe the monarchs can make these choices was really exciting to me. But when we first wrote up our paper that showed that some milkweeds are medicinal, and in the discussion of the paper, I speculated that, hey, maybe monarchs can make choices just like chimpanzees can do with specific plants. One of the reviewers of the paper said, well, there's just no way. There's no way that monarchs can do this. And I thought, well, I don't know about that, so I wanted to disprove them, and we did. And so I think, yes, from there, I wanted to learn more about other animals doing it, but I also kept on running into this idea of people just not believing it and saying, there's no way that an animal can do this. And it started, like you said earlier, that chimpanzees can medicate themselves was discovered in the 1980s by scientists. And even then people said, there's no way chimpanzees can do this. First of all, there's no way they get sick. There's no way they have this knowledge. And then you do insects. Oh, there's no way that something with a tiny brain can do this. And it just wasn't satisfying to me. And I thought, well, we need to give these animals more credit.
Go back to the chimpanzees for a sec. So this was the 80s and it was Michael Huffman, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Will you tell that story and like how much he was up against in terms of science not believing him?
Yeah, I love that story for multiple reasons. And one of the reasons is that Mike Huffman is a primatologist who came from the United States, but did his training in primatology in Japan. And that's important because in Japan, they have much less of an issue with humans being like animals than in, say, the United States or Europe. And that's because of their history. They don't have that dualism that has been very much instilled by Western society. And so when they do primatology, they actually give their chimpanzees or other primates that they study, give them names. And so in American, European primatology, the idea was you have to give the animals numbers because they're just numerical representatives of a species. They don't have personalities, and we have to be careful to assign personalities because then we're anthropomorphizing, and we cannot do that. So the Japanese primatology didn't have that at all. And the other thing that I like about it is that Mike Huffman didn't do this work on his own. He did it with Mohammadi Saifu Kalunde. And he was a ranger for the Tanzania National Parks, but he was also a Watongwe healer. So he was a traditional healer in the local community there. And he actually came from a long line of traditional healers. So his grandfather was a healer as well. I think his mother was a healer as well. And so the two of them were tracking this chimpanzee named Chausiku and noticed that she was behaving differently than normal. So she was lethargic. She had very dark urine. She lay down when defecating. And those are all sorts of things that chimpanzees normally don't do. And then they witnessed her going to a plant that she normally wouldn't eat. And she would take off a branch of the plant, strip the bark off, and then start chewing the inner pith of the branch. And, and the power here was that Mohammadi knew that plant, and he explained to Huffman, this is called bitter leaf. It's a plant we use in traditional medicine. It has all sorts of medicinal properties. And then Huffman thought, wow, that's interesting. Maybe the chimpanzee is using medicine as well. And they weren't studying medicine at all, right? Because actually what they were trying to figure out is what is the role of older chimpanzees in the societal structure in these chimpanzee groups. So this was kind of just a really haphazard observation. But then when Huffman heard that from Mohammadi, So, wow, that's exciting. Maybe she's using medicine. So they went back to the base camp, and then he started extracting chemicals from the plants to see if they were toxic against little fish that he caught from a little stream. And then he said he was so excited he couldn't sleep that night because he wanted to see what was going to happen the next day. So they went back, followed Chao Sifu, and then found that 24 hours after she had ingested the plant, she was active again. She started running again. She was actually reunited with her infant, because she had an infant that kind of she couldn't look after when she was sick, and other members in the group looked after him. So they got reunited. And, and the other thing that Mohammedi said at the time is when we use it in our medicine, it's usually 24 hours until the healing effects start taking hold. But then when Hoffman was telling other people about this, other scientists said, there's no way, chimpanzees don't get sick. There's nothing there that makes them sick. There's no way they can use medicine. And so then really for him, the challenge was, okay, I believe what I saw, but I need to prove it. And I need to prove that chimpanzees do get sick and that the plant they use can help, right? And so then he did many different studies to find out that chimpanzees often get parasitic worms that can be really detrimental to them. They live in their guts, and then also found that when they use these plants, they actually expel the worms from their guts. And so that makes them better. But it was really years of research that he used to really prove that point. And then having more observations to show other chimpanzees do this too, when they have similar symptoms, when they have these worms, and they recover again within that same amount of time, right? So the power is, have one observation, but then repeatedly seeing it, other animals doing it. That really helped him, and that helped persuade a lot of other people. So from there, people said, okay, this, not everyone, but more and more people started saying, okay, yeah, we can see this, chimpanzees can do this. And then, of course, it was like, well, chimpanzees are pretty much like us, so it's not that surprising, no?
Exactly. And it was recently, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was an orangutan that was seen healing its own wound with plants. Like in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And that was the first time. It just feels like all this stuff feels like we should have known. I know you're saying indigenous people knew all this forever.
Right. But, humans are so laser focused, right? And you see what you're looking for. I was just at a conference a few weeks ago learning that bumblebees make tons of little holes in leaves of flowers. And people didn't know it. And it's like, well, we have looked at bumblebees forever. So it's once you start seeing it, you see more of it. So I think that's happened here as well. But you're right. The orangutan study recently. So this was an orangutan who had been in a fight, had a wound on his face. And then they witnessed the orangutan going to a specific liana, a specific plant, and then mixing the leaf with his saliva and then rubbing that into the wound repeatedly until the wound was healed. And it's not the first case of orangutan using medicinal plants, because we have also known about orangutans doing similar things with plants and then rubbing it into their joints. So there's some, and those plants they use are known to have like relief for arthritis and things like that. But it was the first case of an orangutan treating his wounds. But a year before that, there was a study in current biology where people showed that chimpanzees do similar things, but with insects. So they're often seen, grabbing insects from the air, mixing with their saliva, and then putting that in their wounds or in the wounds of others. So it's not just, treating their own wounds, but also treating the wounds of the members in their social groups. So, but yeah, that's all the last few years. And so I think once you know that you can expect this, you start seeing more of it. And I think that's the power of the growing field. But also, hopefully, one of the things that this book will do is basically just open people's eyes and say, well, orangutans can do, chimpanzees, butterflies, so what cannot, right? So just approach nature with a more open mind, and you will probably find many more examples.
And like you said, and you say in the book too, that this is all being rediscovered now, and it was discovered ages ago. And one of the animals you talk about are bears. Basically, bears discovered aspirin. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I drove people nuts when I was going through my bear phase. In writing this book and researching this book, I got so obsessed with bears. I was reading so many books. And there were just moments we were on field work And it was like, I just kept on going. People was like, okay, can we, they couldn't bear it anymore, so to say.
But it's so cool. It's so
it is
incredible.
So cool. Yeah. So we know very well for Native Americans that bears are really, really important. And they're really, the animal that they view as the master of medicine. And so, and it's not just Native Americans, it's also indigenous people in North Siberia and Northern Europe. So anywhere where people really have lived with bears have played a really important role in their culture. And it's partly because bears are really dangerous, so they earn a lot of respect, but also because they're very similar to humans in terms of their diet. And so they have a very omnivorous diet like we do. They're one of few species that actually have the right claws to dig up roots, like we do. And so there is a lot of overlap. And so what you see in a lot of these indigenous cultures is that traditional healers and shamans would actually become bears in their rituals. And that was their way of becoming one with bears and learning from their knowledge. And there's beautiful stories of stories about plants where the plants tell the healers, hey, you want to know how medicinal we are, go and ask the bear, because the bear knows all our secrets. And so when you look at all these different cultures, you see that in all these different Native American tribes, they have specific medicines that are named after bears. So bear medicine is a very common name for different types of medicinal plants that they use. And so there has been a lot of observation. But yeah, then aspirin is so interesting because where that came from is most likely copying bears as well. Because what bears do, they go in hibernation in the winter, and when they come out after several months, they're, you can imagine if you're still for that amount of time, and you're going to be stiff and you're going to be sore. And so one of the first things they do is when they come out of their burrows is that they actually start ripping off the bark of willow trees and start eating that. And that bark is full of salicylic acid that is anti-inflammatory. And it's that chemical that then was rediscovered in the 1700s to, you can use it as an anti-inflammatory. And then a pharmaceutical industry adjusted the formula a little bit and made it into aspirin. Right. But it really seems that that drug that so many of us have used and that we really associate with, the main kind of example of pharmaceutical industry, you got your beautiful little white pill in a box and, with the right dose and you take it. But it seems that bears gave it to us.
When you say in the book, and that a lot of our knowledge of medicine, especially in parts of the world where medicine is traditional healers, it comes from animals. And you talk about, we don't really know how much comes from animals because often with so many healers, it's their secrets. They don't say where their knowledge comes from as much. But clearly for centuries and forever, we've learned from animals.
Yeah, no, and it's right. So I have a really good colleague who I also mentioned in the book, Cassandra Clave. She does a lot of ethnobotany. And so that is, talking to traditional healers in different cultures and trying to find out, what do you use? And with the idea of can we kind of utilize traditional medicine to help us, in the drug discovery process. So rather starting from scratch, when we figure out we have an ailment, we want to find a drug, so we're just going to randomly test all these different compounds. Can we make that search easier by relying on what people have done for hundreds or thousands of years? And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of mutual respect and trust to actually get traditional healers to reveal those secrets, because oftentimes they're passed on and only orally from healer to the next generation. And oftentimes these healers run in families, so it gets passed on that way. And a lot of these medicines are sacred, and so they're not easily shared. So even within the communities, a lot of people wouldn't know what they get when they are treated. And so that you see that with the traditional medicine, but it also means that oftentimes we don't actually know where it came from. And so we can only guess, how many of these things came from animals. But what we do know is, when you have people like Mike Hoffman, who had this relationship with Mohammadi, who was a traditional healer, who could tell him firsthand My grandfather was watching a porcupine. The porcupine had bloody diarrhea. He saw the porcupine dig up a root and started eating it. Then the porcupine recovered. So then his grandfather was going to use that and test it on himself and say, okay, this can work. And then using that. Similar with an elephant that he witnessed, an elephant with stomach upset, took a particular plant and then mixed it with water in the mouth. So making this concoction and then swallowing it, started using that. And that's a treatment that is widely used in Tanzania even today. And so we know that healers have done it. We just don't know the extent to which. But it makes a lot of sense that, especially when you think about how traditional healers and shamans have worked, they haven't felt that separation from nature like Western medics do. And so to rely on the knowledge of other species actually makes a lot of sense. So it's probably a lot more than we know at the moment.
Well, and that's another thing I think your book really just made apparent, even though I think about this quite a bit, is how we have separated ourselves so much from nature and the damage that that's done to us, to nature, to the planet. Okay, one really thing that got me big was that goats are the ones who discovered coffee.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So at Emory University, we have a coffee shop called Dancing Goats, which actually I think actually occurs in a lot of different places. And then we also have a coffee shop called Caldi's. And so according to legend, Caldi was a goat herder in Ethiopia. And when he witnessed that his goats were eating the berries of a coffee bush, he noticed that they became really frisky and very active and alert. And so then he was talking about this to an abbot in a nearby monastery who took some of the berries and then brewed them, started drinking it, and noticed, hey, this makes me alert. And so that is how we think that goats discovered coffee. And you see it in so many, I'm sure that a lot of the people listening know a coffee shop they go to that is named either after the goats or after Caldi. And that's where that comes from. And goats have discovered more things. And one of my favorites is the horny goat weed. So this is a traditional medicine used in traditional Chinese medicine, where it's a plant that is used to treat impotence. And, again, a herder noticed that goats that ate this weed became horny and said, okay, we can use this.
For animals that are doing this, like choosing medicine and knowing what to choose, how much is intellect or learned from their parents and how much is instinct? Oh, we eat that when we feel like this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's where a lot of the initial resistance came from, where scientists said, well, unless you have really clever intellect and big brains like us and maybe chimpanzees, there's just no way you could gain this knowledge and use it when you need it. But then you start seeing that animals such as ants and bees and butterflies can do it. And of course, they have learning abilities, but they don't have the same kind of inferential abilities that we have, right? So, and it's interesting because, again, this idea that you need to learn from each other. And, it's, of course, very much driven by the way we do medicine, right? To learn medicine, you go to medical school, and it's a lot of years of education. But sometimes you forget that humans do a lot of things that are innate as well. When we are sick, we don't like to eat or even smell specific things that we may have loved the day before, right? So, and that's our bodies telling us you shouldn't have this right now. On the flip side, you think about people that are pregnant, have all sorts of cravings that they normally didn't have before then. And that is basically their bodies that are nourishing a fetus telling them, you need to eat this because there are specific minerals that you're lacking right now and we need it. So I think we sometimes seem to forget that our bodies are telling us a lot of things that we are not even aware of. So when you look at animals, they develop these medicinal behaviors in these different ways. So there's innate, there's individual learning, and then there is social learning. One of the most clear examples right now, I think, for this innate ability is based on caterpillars called woolly bear caterpillars. So these are these very fuzzy caterpillars. A lot of people call them fuzzy wuzzies. And these caterpillars often get attacked by parasitoid flies. Now, these flies are a bit like Alien in the sci-fi movie. So what they do is these flies lay eggs on top of the caterpillar. And then when the eggs hatch, the maggot comes out, eats their way into the caterpillar, and then eats up the caterpillar from the inside out until it's ready to pupate. And that's when it bursts out of the body of the caterpillar. And that kills the caterpillar. If you love parasites, this is amazing. If you don't, this is gross. But I love parasites. So I think it's a really quite spectacular life cycle. But of course, it's not good for the caterpillar. It turns out these caterpillars, when they eat a diet that has a lot of chemicals called alkaloids, it actually kills the flies. And so when they are infected with these fly maggots, they actually increase their taste for these alkaloids. Meaning when they're infected, the alkaloid just tastes better. So they keep on eating more of it. And that way their body is just making them ingest more alkaloids that will then help against this parasitoid fly. So that's a really good example of an innate mechanism that's just there based on the taste receptor, based on the taste. These caterpillars don't have to know what they're doing at all. It's their bodies telling them, this tastes good, eat more of it. So that's one. But then animals can learn from their individual experiences. And this has been shown in so many different animals, including goats and sheep. So they can make associations when they're sick. They eat a particular plant, they start feeling better. That can be as late as 24 or 48 hours later. They can make that association. Next time they're sick, they know what to choose. And then there is social learning as well. So animals can learn from each other what to use. And so they often see other individuals in the group using something. They may copy that behavior. They may learn to, that maybe what the animal who was sick was eating was very bitter tasting. So next time they are sick, they may try something bitter, and then the individual learning kicks in. So, yeah. But animals, the bodies of animals are pretty clever.
Yeah.
Even if it's not in the brain, the guts are pretty clever too.
Well, and us too, right? Our bodies are really smart, and smarter than I think we know these days, because we don't allow them to be like we used to.
That's right. And it's one of the things that I found really intriguing is that this idea of, you don't need to know what you're doing to get better can also work the other way around. Sometimes our brain cannot overcome what our gut is telling us. And so this is very clear, for example, when people get food poisoning. They eat something, they get food poisoning, but they often make the association with something that didn't actually cause the food poisoning, right? And they know this. And so it's not just in food poisoning, it's also with chemotherapy that's used in cancer. So that when people get the chemotherapy, which makes them really sick, they often then their bodies associate that sickness with the food they had when they started the chemotherapy. And that can be chocolate or ice cream or pancakes, things that, they know absolutely didn't cause their sickness. And they know that, but their body says, no way, right? So sometimes that big brain of us actually gets in the way of doing the right thing.
Okay, one last animal, because this is such a crazy story I want to hear about, are the finches in Mexico City and the cigarette butts.
Yeah, so this is a great story as well. And it's probably one of my favorite parts of the book, partly because I went over there to meet the researchers that did the research on this, and partly because it's just so counterintuitive that birds would be using something that's so bad, cigarettes, to help them, right? And so this is a story that started actually with an undergraduate student, Montse Suarez Rodriguez, at UNAM in Mexico City. And she and her advisor were really interested in understanding how does urbanization affect nest building in birds. So they were expecting birds to really suffer from all the rubbish and all the litter that people discard in the streets. And so, maybe find plastic and then getting stuck and all sorts of things. But what they noticed when they were studying the nests of house finches and house sparrows is that they contained a lot of white, fluffy material. And they couldn't figure out what it was at first until it rained. And then what she noticed is that, hey, this smells of smoke. So maybe this white stuff is actually the fibers from the cigarette butts, the filters from the cigarettes, and then the birds must have picked them apart and put them in their nests. And her advisor, Constantino Macias Garcia, he didn't believe it at first. And she had to actually give him a wet nest to say, no, look, it smells of smoke. And so from there on, they said, okay, so it looks like the birds are using cigarette butts. Then they found if nests have more of the cigarette butts in them. They have fewer parasites. And then we talk about blood-sucking parasites, such as ticks and lice, the things that on the chicks just cause a lot of harm, eat a lot of their blood. And then they did this intriguing experiment where they had different nests and they made this lining, and then they either added ticks that were alive or they added ticks that were dead, right? With the prediction, if the ticks are alive, they're going to suck the blood of the chicks, and then the bird should respond by collecting more cigarette butts. If the ticks are dead, the bird shouldn't care because they're not doing any harm to their chicks anyway. And that's exactly what they found. So they found that the parents of the chicks in the nest that had live ticks started collecting more cigarette butts. So there was this strong response that there's a threat to my chicks. I'm going to collect cigarette butts, and that then expels the ticks from the nest. And yeah, so utterly amazing. And kind of ironic too that, because why are there so many cigarette butts? It's actually because a lot of the scientists at UNAM, because they are not allowed to smoke inside, they go outside, litter their cigarette butts. It's very easy material for the birds to collect. They don't have to fly far. They actually make their nests on the buildings of the university. Then they put the cigarette butts in there, and it protects their chicks against parasites. But it's not harmless. And that's something we see with lots of medicine. And so in this case, we know cigarettes are not good. They're toxic. So the nicotine itself is bad, but smoked cigarette butts have a lot of other bad chemicals in them. And so they also noticed that the chicks had some malformations in their red blood cells. And so, and that's why we see often with medicine, there's benefits, but there's costs. And that's why we have to dose it well, right? And try to avoid medicines when we don't need them.
And in terms of dosing well, do you think animals are good doctors in that sense?
Yes. Yeah. Because you see it, for example, to go back to the chimpanzees that we mentioned earlier, is the plants that they use that are so bitter that it kills the parasites. If they eat too much of the plant, they die themselves. And so you only see them using it when they are infected with parasites, and only then do they eat. And they only eat it for one day. They don't keep on eating it. And you see this with a lot of different animals. Goats actually really avoid the medicinal plants that kill worms because they taste so bad. But when they have worms, they start using them. And as soon as they have cleared the worms, they stop eating them again. So animals are really, really good at dosing themselves.
So with this knowledge, and it was knowledge that a lot of people have all over the world, mostly indigenous people, but knowledge that we've kind of lost in Western society. And here it is again, right? Mm-hmm. You brought it back in this book, and all these researchers are working on it. How does this help us go forward better?
Yeah. First of all, it will, I hope.
Yeah.
And it's already happening. So there's several ways. So honeybees, as a lot of us know, honeybees aren't doing well. So a lot of bees die every winter. And interestingly, bees are really good at using medicine. And the way they do it mostly is by collecting resin, which is the sticky stuff that trees and other plants produce. They bring that to their nest, mix it with their wax, and then make it into a substance called propolis. And they line that on inside their colony. Now, wild bees, they're inside hollow trees. So there's a lot of crevices and cracks, and they fill that up to make this beautiful, smooth envelope of propolis. The problem with bee boxes, when we put bees in boxes, the planks are smooth. They have nowhere to put the propolis except in the corners. And where the lid meets the walls, that's where they fill it up. And beekeepers hate it because it makes the lid stuck. So they have selected against bees that use this a lot, and they keep on removing it. So they actually keep on removing the medicinal substances that the bees need. And so with very simple changes, you can actually make planks that are rough and that have grooves in them, and then the bees will fill those up. So you reintroduce a lot of the propolis, and then you make the bees basically medicate themselves. And then human medicine. We mentioned several examples before. We also mentioned ethnobotany, right, where scientists go to traditional healers and try to revisit their medicine to basically have a shortcut to drug discovery that we can use for pharmaceutical development. And so, but what you see people doing now is like, even skip that and go straight to the animals. So let's look at chimpanzees and bonobos and butterflies. dogs and cats and goats. See what do they do when they're sick? There's so many of the things that they get sick with, we have in common, whether it's worms or protozoans, bacteria, viruses. So when they use something, and they have done this for millions of years, then we can learn something and maybe find compounds that work better than, say, some of the antibiotics that we use that result in resistance within just a few years.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I also think on top of all of that, I think it's just in this time when we are so separate and so many species are on the verge of extinction and so many have already gone extinct, it's just like one more big piece of information that, of course, they're important for their own sakes, but they're important for the whole big ecosystem of all of us. And it's just another reminder.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what I tried to say in the last chapter is that, for me, I love nature and I love animals and I love parasites too. So, for me, it's always been a no-brainer that we should do everything we can to protect nature and to preserve nature. But I think this is, for people that maybe are not that inclined, you can also use the economic argument, right? Or the human health argument to say, well, a lot of plants out there are potential medicine, and a lot of animals are pharmacists that can teach us a thing or two. So if we lose the plants, we lose the medicine. If we lose the animals, we lose the teachers. So let's keep them.
Thank you so much, Jaap, for writing this book, for putting it out there. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
To learn more about Jaap and to read his book, Doctors by Nature, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polkilink, Hannah Gabrielson, Lorraine Doherty, Bethany Jones, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.